continues.
Joining us now to discuss the Israel-Iran conflict and U.S. military capabilities is retired Rear Admiral and Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Senior Fellow Mark Montgomery. Mark, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me, Tammy.
Why don't we start by having you remind our audience about the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. What's the mission? Who do you work with?
Yeah, thanks. So FDD is a nonpartisan think tank. We fashion ourselves a do tank. We study issues, particularly only national security issues. And we look very particularly at beleaguered democracies like Israel, Taiwan, Ukraine, the Republic of Korea. And we also study the four axis of aggressors, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and try to figure out how can we best support those democracies, combat the axis of aggressors, draw attention to that, whether it's legislative changes, executive branch changes, or how the public opinion sees those. So we really do focus our research on those beleaguered democracies and try to defend them. So obviously this Iran-Israel dust-up is of interest to us because Iran is one of the principal members of the axis of aggressors. They've supported Russia pretty heavily in the war on Ukraine, and they've threatened Israel and the United States.
And the dust-up, as you put it, between Israel and Iran has now entered its second week. What is your assessment of the current situation?
So at this point, I think Israel has struck most of their primary target sets. So they've hit the leadership, the generals and the scientists who developed and implement the nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. They've hit most of the accessible nuclear development sites, so Natanz, Isfahan, and they've done as much damage as I think they can do with their type of the weapons that they employ. But they've also hit the ballistic missile production sites, the industrial sites that support missile and nuclear weapons development. And I think they've hit launchers out in the field, particularly as those launchers are used to strike against Israel. They've been doing that, and they've completely neutered the Iranian air defense system and the Iranian Air Force.
There have been assessments, hosts and people who have said what we're seeing is it's the start of World War III, something you've disagreed with. Explain.
Yeah, so I don't think it's the start of World War III. I think this is a campaign being executed by Israel, much like their campaign against Hezbollah last fall, and it's to remove one of the major threats. I think Israel came to the conclusion that Iran is hell-bent on developing a nuclear weapon, that the negotiations weren't fruitful. I think President Trump shared that assessment of the negotiations. He'd given the negotiation period 60 days. On 60 days and about 8 hours, the Israelis struck. I think most authoritarian states have come to believe that when democracies set deadlines, they don't mean anything. I would put the one caveat in that. If one of the democracies involved is Israel, you better believe they mean something. So I think this is a campaign. I think it's to remove it. I think they could stop today. I don't think they will, because I think they've probably set back the nuclear program months or a year or two, and they would like to set it back multiple years since they've taken this risk of knocking out their defense systems. I think they'd really like the United States to assist with that. But I do think that this has a termination, and that termination is not that far away.
Our guest is former Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. He's with us for the next 35 minutes or so talking about the Israel-Iran conflict and U.S. military capabilities. If you have a question or comment for him, you can start calling in now. The lines: Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents 202-748-8002. Mark, wanted to ask you about President Trump and the actions that he's taken. He's said that he will decide on possible U.S. military intervention in the next 2 weeks. When we're looking at that, what options could be on the table?
Yeah, thanks. So I was disappointed he said that. I think we have the information we need to make a decision now. But as you look at it, the options on the table are to do nothing, allow Israel to just kind of work the fringes of what's left, which is the Fordo plant is what most people are looking at. That's the plant where the uranium that's been enriched to 5% at Natanz and others is enriched to a weapons-grade state. It's reportedly 3,000 centrifuges, very deeply underground. and very reinforced. So it's a tough target. So the first one would be allow Israel to continue to work the margins of that. I think that will set the program back more months, but probably not years. The second plan would be for the United States to strike Fordo. And you do that with the B-2 stealth bomber dropping the massive ordnance penetrator, which is about a 30,000-pound weapon that, as it hits the ground, kind of has special casing that allows it to burrow in, and then a secondary detonation, a fusing detonation that occurs. If you go on FDD's website, we have a very nice graphic of this that kind of shows it. And then you can put further weapons down that channel that's been burrowed by the first one. So that's kind of how you get a very, very deeply buried target. And it's really the only weapon like it in the world, a conventional weapon like it in the world. So to me, that's the second effort. Really, the president has that stark thing. Either you take action or you don't take action. And I think if you take action, then you have to be prepared for an Iranian response, and there's more things that follow from that. But that's the challenge he faces in 2 weeks. If he doesn't just kick it another 2 weeks, as we've seen him do in the Russia-Ukraine negotiations.
You said that you were disappointed in President Trump's decision to put a 2-week possible deadline on this. Explain the pros and cons of waiting versus taking an immediate response.
Yeah, and there are both. It should be clear that good people can make either decision and be all right. But if you did the attack now, I think you could bring this to termination. Strike the Fordo plant, flatten it, get some kind of battle damage assessment that says everything in there is destroyed, turn to the Israelis and say, we're done. And at that point, Israel, which is very dependent on the United States for munitions, they're using F-35s and F-15s procured from the United States. The munitions are generally procured from the United States. They would have to stop. That it ends it. And I think that's good in terms of civilian casualties in both Iran and Israel. And sometimes it's hard to understand that actually taking a military action can lead to less casualties, but I think that's the truth in this case. Now, if you wait 2 weeks, you get another type of savings, which is, I would assume, over these 2 weeks, the U.S. is completing its mandatory evacuation of military dependence from Bahrain, from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, but there's quite a few in Bahrain. They're all out. American expatriates who don't want to be under a potential Iranian counterstrike, they leave. And then we bring in more air defense systems for our troops who can't leave, who are in Iraq, in Bahrain, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia. So we do provide extra force protection for our forces in that 2 weeks, and I'm confident the Pentagon is aggressively taking advantage of these 2 weeks to do that. So that's kind of your trade space. End it faster, probably less civilian casualties overall. Give yourself 2 weeks so that you can have a better force protection for your military personnel and all the families out, although I think by now almost all are out.
We have callers waiting to talk with you. We'll start with Gabriel in Silver Spring, Maryland, line for Democrats. Good morning, Gabriel.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question for this Rear Admiral. Sir, have you ever heard of the Gulf of Tonkin? Have you ever heard of WMD in Iraq? And all this turned out to be false. Again, where is the proof that Netanyahu has about developing 9 bombs in Iraq? He's trying to suck in Trump, who is his greatest ally in America, and Trump is falling for it. Where is the proof that these people, you're going to bring in America into this war again? Now, everything that has been said in previous times about war in other countries has turned out to be false. And America needs to be very careful the way they listen to Netanyahu, who is a warmonger. He couldn't stop the killing of 1,700 Israeli by these terrorists in Gaza. How come?
So I am aware of the Gulf of Tonkin, and I'm aware of the invasion of Iraq. And I'm also aware of, Hitler invading Poland, right? So some things are true, some things are not true. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has been tracking and reporting on Iranian compliance and more recently non-compliance with inspections. Clearly, Iran has an interest in developing a nuclear weapon. They developed the ballistic missiles to deliver that weapon. They've threatened two countries principally: little Satan, that's Israel; big Satan, that's the United States. So I understand why I think Israel particularly feels that if Iran were to get a weapon, the bar for usage by the Iranians against the Jewish state, is much lower than any other place in the world. So Netanyahu is taking aggressive action, and the United States, President Trump, is correct to support Prime Minister Netanyahu in this attack. So I think this is different than the Gulf of Tonkin. It's different than the invasion of Iraq. It's more akin to actions against Germany in 1941 than Vietnam in 1965.
You mentioned troop position in several countries there in the Middle East. What does the current U.S. military presence look like in that area, the surrounding area? And also, what has changed over the past week? What has the U.S. done to possibly increase their presence there?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there has been a plus up. So prior to this conflict starting, this phase of the campaign starting, we had an American aircraft carrier strike group. I commanded one of those. It's normally an aircraft carrier, 4 or 5 destroyers or cruisers, and most importantly, the air wing to the aircraft carrier. One was here already to deal with the problems with the Houthis in the Red Sea. The Vincent Carrier Strike Group was there, and then there's other disassociated destroyers in the area of the Middle East and potentially submarines. In addition, and then other services. The Air Force has squadrons in Al Udeid, F-35 squadrons, F-15 squadrons that have been plussed up over the last few months. And we had some bomber forces in Diego Garcia. That's kind of the laydown initially. What's happened is we've plussed up forces. The aircraft carrier strike group that was coming in to relieve the one on station, the USS Nimitz, its carrier strike group was accelerated through the Pacific and is going to arrive on station to have 2 aircraft carrier strike groups at the same time. The Army is pulling in more air defense assets, so they have THAAD and Patriot assets spread throughout the Middle East, including a THAAD system in Israel. But the ones I'm talking about are coming more forward to where the U.S. forces are to defend them. And then finally, we keep a small number of destroyers off in the Eastern Mediterranean that could provide ballistic missile defense protection to Israeli cities. They've now been pushed up against, closer to the coast, and they've been supplemented with additional destroyers, so that we have a number of destroyers off the coast in the Eastern Mediterranean, off the coast of Israel. So that's those are the defensive, mostly those are considered defensive assets at this point. If you wanted to strike, you could turn the carrier strike group planes into, they could do a strike mission. The Air Force planes from Al Udeid and Qatar could do a strike mission. But probably most importantly, you have B-2 bombers. Now the B-2 bombers, those pilots could be sleeping in their beds in the Midwest of the United States the night before a strike, take off, conduct a 36-hour mission, probably a lot of no-dos and 5-hour energy, and conduct a mission and come back. And we can rotate planes through that mission night after night after night. So those don't have to be brought forward. But everything else is kind of gets into the theater and executes it. So the short answer is quite a bit more is in theater. This is why I also think you need to end this. Right? This constant surging of forces into the Middle East over the last 25 years does have an impact on military readiness. There's no doubt about it. We maintained 2 carrier strike groups in the early 2010s in the Middle East, and it broke Navy and Air Force readiness 5 or 6 years later when we couldn't generate forces. So one of the reasons you want to end this problem, set back the Iranian nuclear program, is to stop this kind of build up to do nothing. To actually go complete the execution of the mission.
Let's talk with Justin in Florida, Line for Independence. Good morning, Justin.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for your service, sir. I want to pick up right where you just left off. I have a three-part technical question. Number one, if the mission is to take out these underground nuclear facilities, do you envision that being a single night operation, or is this a multi-day operation? Question 2 is, what do you assess the likelihood, regardless of the length, do you assess that the likelihood of that mission and specifically hitting these underground targets with the ordinances that we have to be reasonably likely to succeed? And finally, how do we verify that in a time where propaganda is almost more important than fact? how do we verify the success of the operation and then fight back against the inevitable Iranian propaganda that the operation was not successful? So I'll hang up, and again, thank you for your service.
Well, thank you. That's a great question. I'll try to take them in order. The first part, I imagine it's multi-day. I just think, you'll want to do assessments in between several attacks. And so I imagine that the plan will be for a multi-day attack. Whether it ends up being a multi-day attack depends on the effectiveness of the first strike. The second is, what's the likelihood of success? Look, anyone who tells you they know the answer to that is probably fibbing, right? I mean, you don't know these sorts of things. I think we've done a lot of engineering, a lot of testing, but I also think the Iranians have done a lot. They're a creative defender, so they may have created some perturbations in their defenses that make it harder to get through. So I think it's more likely than not to succeed, but anyone who says they know it will succeed or know it will fail, I think probably doesn't know what they're talking about. And the third is that, how do you assess it? Well, look, we have a pretty good way of measuring seismic activity in that region. We have good ways of, we have very good overhead imagery. We have signals intelligence. The Israelis appear to have a very good human intelligence network. So between the two of us, I think we'll have a pretty good assessment of how it went and whether further campaigning is needed against it. But my guess is several days with assessments, and it will likely be successful.
Let's hear from Voyle in Chattanooga, Tennessee, line for Democrats. Good morning, Voyle.
Hello?
Hello?
I'm talking about there's three things that I would like to have.
Voyle, can you go ahead and turn your television down in the background?
Three things I would like to know. That I was going to destroy the DDG, and I would like to know that where's deterrent? Who used to talk about deterrent? If they get one nuclear weapon, they ain't going to use that one nuclear weapon. Not on somebody else got 5, got 100, got 400. He's not a threat to nobody. But that's all we heard. If Russia hit us, tear the United States completely up, within 10 minutes, they're going to be destroyed. So why should I use one weapon? I ain't got but 1 or 2 or 3. And you got 200? That don't make sense. And they don't have a weapon. One nuclear weapon couldn't do nothing to the United States. Period. So I don't understand what they're talking about. Oh, we got to stop them from having nuclear weapon. They said it about North Korea. North Korea got a nuclear weapon. What is they doing with it? Nothing. But people think, oh, you get a nuclear weapon, ooh.
Voyle, we'll get a response from Mark.
Listen, that's a fair question to ask, where's deterrence in this? And certainly, when you talk about two large nation states like Russia and the United States, there is a mutual assured deterrence strategy that prevents us from doing large-scale nuclear strikes on each other. But Doyle had an interesting word in there. He said, it doesn't make sense. And I would say that's the concern. The concern is that the Islamic Republic of Iran, they don't necessarily make sense in their decision-making. This is a country that could be highly successful, 90 million people, incredible natural resources, a good university system, and previously, and they fritter this away by pursuing a nuclear weapon capability that puts them at odds with Israel. They threaten the state of Israel with extinction on a routine basis. So, make sense is not something that we can apply to the thought process of Iranian leadership. So we have to take them at their word that if they get a weapon, they would use it. Therefore, we need to prevent them from getting a weapon. Sometimes deterrence doesn't work, and when deterrence doesn't work, you need to defeat your adversary, and that's how Israel's approaching this.
Let's hear from Stephen in Dewey, Arizona, line for Republicans. Good morning, Stephen.
Yep. I'd like to get your knowledge on this. I mean, if October 7th didn't happen, I think Gaza would still be up, and they wouldn't be in Iran. So do they take orders, Hezbollah and Hamas, from Iran? Iran, we know we fund both of those terrorist groups. And I think the Iranian people should be aware that their government is causing havoc all over the Middle East. And if October 7th didn't happen, Gaza would still be up, and Iran wouldn't be attacked. But I think it's on Iran that they're being attacked now. How far it goes, we'll see. But Israel does have the right, since that is the head of the snake, and I think even Democrats believe that they're the cause of the terrorists in the region. So I'd just like to know, does Iran give orders to these terrible terrorist groups?
That's a great question. That's exactly right. I mean, Iran is the head of the snake. They have given orders. Now, the orders they give, their closest allies were Hezbollah, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC proxies in Syria and in Iraq, and then the Houthis in Yemen. And they had they had support relationships with Hamas. So all these countries acted on orders from Iran. Now, what's happened recently is that the Israelis have neutralized Hezbollah. They're fully engaged with Hamas, and they've struck hard. You know, the minute Assad fell, they destroyed the Syrian Air Force and air defense systems. So they created the conditions where they could more easily get to Iran without Iran using its proxies to counterstrike. That was the problem in previous negotiations with Iran. We failed to deal with the fact that they were supporting all these terrorist groups and proxy groups that were attacking Israel. And so now Israel's handled that problem, and Iran is much more cleanly the primary adversary and one against which they can campaign with some freedom. And that's probably why you see this happen. So I do think there's a direct lineage back to October 7th. But again, you're absolutely right. The caller's right that it's driven by Iranian support for this terrorist network over the last few decades that has culminated in the strikes on Iran. So Iran's people should know that their own government caused this problem.
You mentioned the B-52 and the bunker busting bomb. That's something that we've been hearing a lot about because it's something that Israel could need, and only we have it. Beyond that, what could U.S. military participation look like? What should it look like? What should we avoid?
So I hope we're constrained to just the B-2 stealth bomber and the massive ordnance penetrators. But you're absolutely right. There could be a response by the Iranians to that against U.S. forces. And there could be a response, even without that strike. The Iranians could foolishly strike U.S. forces in a way to lash out. I suspect they won't do that, but they could. I think it is likely they'll respond against U.S. forces if we hit them with the B-2s. Once that happens, now I think you bring in the carrier-based strike aircraft, the U.S. Air Force aircraft, strike aircraft that are in stationed throughout the Middle East, and then we would begin to remove surface-to-surface missile capabilities, anti-ship cruise missile capabilities, the defense industrial base that's remaining inside Iran that supports that. And so, I think you would see the United States remove the threat to U.S. forces in the Middle East completely. And as much as Israel has conducted a fairly comprehensive campaign, if the U.S. becomes involved, I think it would be a tripling of the strikes each day. In other words, two times as many from the United States as Israel is doing right now. You'd see a very extensive one. And we would bring our own refueling aircraft, which would make the Israelis more effective to be able to use our refueling aircraft as well. So in general, you'd see a more comprehensive strike campaign that would completely eliminate the defense industrial base and the military of Iran.
Let's talk with Peter in Massachusetts, line for Independence. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning. We have two countries in the Middle East that are nuclear capable. One of them spied on us, stole technology, developed atomic bombs in secret, and is called the only democracy in the Middle East, even though it has huge communist tendencies. The other one, we overthrew their government in 1953 and installed the Shah, who was so bad that you had a popular uprising. While the Shah was in power, we trained nuclear engineers for Iran. When you start messing around with this stuff, you cannot predict the outcomes. Hardware is great, and looking back, 2020 hindsight, we know everything about the hardware of World War II, and someday they will look back on this and they'll know all about our technology and our bombs and things like that. We don't want to get to that point. We don't need to do this. IAEA is allowed into Iran and has said they're not making a bomb. Tulsi Gabbard said, until she got her come to meeting Jesus meeting, they're not making a bomb. Israel has it and won't let IAEA come in and is ready to drop it with the Samson option. They even have a name for all their cute little things that they do. We can't do this. We can't afford another 20-year war. The value of the dollar is going down. We have had our currency, our credit lowered by the credit ratings of the world. We can't afford to do that. We're not unlimited in our financial abilities, and they've got 90 million people in Iran. What are we going to do? Try and knock a country a quarter the size of ours back into the Stone Age? You can't.
So thanks. I would take offense at the description of Israel not being a democracy. Israel's a democracy. I think if spying on friends make you not a democracy, then the United States would not be a democracy. So let's not go there. They're a country under siege. They've been fighting, they would say, a 7 or 8 front war. I would say it's really Iran and its proxies against them, but in any case, it comes from every angle. So it's absolutely appropriate for them to be constantly searching for facts about the Iranian program. I agree the United States involvement in Iran since Kermit Roosevelt in 1953 has not been, did not redound well on our reputation. We handled that poorly. That has nothing to do with should we allow the Islamic Republic of Iran to develop a nuclear weapon and the ballistic missile systems to deliver it to first Israel and then the United States. The answer to that question is a solid no, and we shouldn't do it. And finally, our credit rating, I don't know if it's tanking, but if America has bad credit, I don't believe it's over the Iran or Israel conflict. It probably has a lot more to do with a future C-SPAN discussion of debt and deficit, not Iran and Israel.
Bill in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, line for Democrats. Good morning, Bill.
Hello. Am I on? Can
yes,
you hear me?
Go ahead, Bill.
Okay. I just want to say I believe what this guest is saying is ludicrous. To kind of follow up on a previous caller, we were going to go into Iraq and just take care of Saddam Hussein, and they were going to greet us with flowers, and that never happened. We left that country destroyed. Afghanistan, we were going to go in and take care of the Taliban. 20 years later, many U.S. and Afghanistani deaths, how many billions, trillions of dollars. Look who's in charge of Afghanistan, the Taliban. Your guest makes it sound like, we're going to go in and we're going to bomb the plant, the nuclear facility in Iran, and it's just going to take care of everything and we'll walk away. No, we'll help create another generation of terrorists. We will destroy another country. We won't walk in and walk away. It ain't going to work like that, sir.
Yeah, thanks. And certainly that caller reflects what isolationists think, which is that if we, that we shouldn't get involved in any of these issues overseas and just continue to operate as the United States. Of course, the United States economy doesn't work that way. The United States economy works on a world trade system that's led by the United States and follows our rules of transparency and the rule of law. And free, open travel, open trading borders. So we can't allow the axis of aggressors to continue to push their version of both security, both military and economic security. And the other thing I'd say is that we can't allow someone a country. If I were Israel, I would not allow a country who states very explicitly, we're going to wipe the Jewish state off the face of the earth. You can't give them the weapon that allows them to wipe the Jewish state off of the earth. Whether it's 1, 2, or 3 weapons, that's enough to destroy Israel, which is a country smaller than the state of New Jersey. And so I fully understand why Israel wants to do it. I understand why President Trump would consider doing this. I will say this about President Trump. I don't agree with him on a lot of issues when it comes to the use of force. He is very reticent to do it. I think he will only do this when it's his personal assessment that it's the only way to stop Iran from getting the weapon. Maybe after this 2-week period of reflection, that's how he'll see things, and he'll use the weapon. But you can say a lot of things about President Trump. You cannot say he's a warmonger. He has generally stepped back from peace, and if you listen to him yesterday, the things he's most proud of are ending conflicts, whether it's India, Pakistan, Rwanda and the Congo, Russia and Ukraine. He even gave 60 days for Iran and Israel. And again, I don't agree with how each one of these has gone, but you can't be critical of his approach in terms of and call him a warmonger.
Mark, I wanted to ask you about something else. You also serve as Senior Director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation at FDD. This headline was in The Hill this week. Could U.S. involvement in Israel-Iran war spark cyber attack? It notes that cyber attacks on Israel have increased 700% since the conflict began. What do we know about these attacks? How could they come back to the U.S.? How could they impact the U.S.? And what are you going to be watching in the coming days?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for bringing that up, because that is an aspect to this, and it's an aspect that could impact our homeland. Now, I will say that there's 2 types of attacks a foreign adversary like China, Russia, Iran can do in cyberspace. One is malicious activity that has been reported to be increased 700% by Iran against Israel. We saw that recently, about 16 months ago. FBI Director Wray pointed out that China had pre-positioned malicious cyber software, malware, or created accesses so they could get into our critical infrastructures in a crisis or wartime. Certainly, China and Russia have the ability to do that. Iran a little less so, but they could do some damage. That's your electrical power grid, your water, your rail systems. But the other area, and one where Iran is capable right now, is influence operations. That's where you get into social media, you create a false narrative. My think tank just published a paper last night by Max Lesser and Maria Riofro that points out we've found Iranian influence operations where Iranians pose as Jewish Americans concerned, or Jews in Israel concerned about attacks, and it spreads fear. Try to get kind of everyone feeling they're under stress and under attack, even more so than they are. And that kind of influence operations is intended to get a public to not support a government's campaign. So cyber malicious activity, influence operations, we're going to see both of them from Iran. Probably more the influence operations than the cyber activity, which is more likely from like a Russia or China and that kind of crisis.
Let's talk with Mickey in Auburn, Illinois, line for Republicans. Hi, Mickey.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for the call. I'm an old U.S. Army combat medic, and I feel safe knowing that President Trump is in charge at this time because he's not going to just willy-nilly advance Lockheed Martin and Boeing and the war complex in this country. To call the situation in the Middle East the Hatfields and the McCoys wouldn't be doing it justice. Israel preaches that they're the, quote, chosen people. I mean, God said they're the chosen ones, and Iran says that if you're not a Muslim and convert to the Muslim belief, you're an infidel and we're going to kill you. This is just no good. Everywhere we go, and I don't know who put us in charge of the world order and all of this stuff, but I'm thinking that President Trump is in charge, and the Israelis have caused tons of trouble. the Iraqis and the Muslim states, of course, tons of trouble, and we're never going to be in the middle. I hope we never get in the middle of it. I hope we just, this gentleman called it isolationism. It's like every time since World War II we've got involved in something, there's been a failure. And I just hope that no boots on the ground and stop Americans deciding who's going to be in charge or who's right and who's wrong. The Koreans got a bomb. The Israelis got a bomb. Well, they're not supposed to. So we pick and choose. And I pray to God that no soldiers, no American lives, no American assets are involved in a war that's going to go on for another 1,000 years. And being an old Army combat medic, I'm sorry for the Rear Admiral that he had to pull Marines around for a bunch of time. But God bless you, and thanks for C-SPAN. Hope you have a great day.
Well, thanks, and thank you for your service as well. So, look, the problem with isolationism is we practiced it fairly effectively in the early 1930s. And while we practiced isolationism, Europe and Asia turned into cauldrons that led to World War II. And the reason we have the high-quality life we have in the United States is not because of trade between Kansas and Nebraska, right? It's because of trade between the United States and the world. We have to have access for our goods, for our services, for our currency around the world. And so there is a reason why we maintain a Navy and build an Army, right? It's in order to ensure that we have the military backing to do those things. President Trump is not trying to get us in a war. I've said to the last caller, I actually think he's almost overly prescriptive in trying to make sure we don't enter a conflict, and there's nothing wrong with that. I have a son in the military myself. However, he has approved of what Israel is doing because he recognizes this is the best way to set back the Iranian nuclear program, which is an existential threat to Israel and a long-term threat to the United States.
Mark Montgomery is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. You can find his work online at fdd.org. Mark, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you very much for having me, Tammy.
We are wrapping up today's Washington Journal with more of your calls in open forum. You can start calling in now. The line's there on your screen. Republicans 202-748-8001.